What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are finally here with Absolute Green Lantern and the origin. So, we're going to do this a little out of order from the way the comics did it, but this initially opens up 5 days before the events that we'll talk about here in a minute. And you initially pick up on a coffee shop with Hal Jordan and John Stewart and Sojourner Mullane, also known as Joe Mullane. Now, Joe Mullane is actually a relatively new Green Lantern in DC Comics. When I say relatively new, I mean, she was introduced in 2020, but when you talk about, when Hal Jordan was introduced, Guy Gardner, Kyle Rayner, John Stewart, she hasn't been around nearly as long. She's kind of a Green Lantern without a home, if I'm being honest, in the sense that she doesn't really protect Earth in the same way that John, Kyle, Hal, and Guy Gardner do. That she actually protects a place called the Far Sector. It's just one of these situations where, because Earth already has so many Green Lanterns, none of which are unpopular enough for DC to kill, they're trying to figure out ways to make her character interesting and to keep her relevant, and DC hasn't quite figured it out yet. The Far Sector storyline is cool, but it's just one of these things where she's just kind of a lantern over there. So to see her here is pretty dope. John Stewart's also the guy who was the former Marine and became an architect. Hal Jordan is a little bit different. Hal Jordan is not the test pilot that you guys are familiar with. In fact, he's actually a collectibles dealer, which is pretty interesting, right? A pretty cool shift with his character. The problem with this is that as they're talking, and you get a little bit of backstory in the sense that Sojourner had at one point served alongside Guy Gardner in the police force here in this town, and then ultimately left and just hasn't quite decided to come back yet. There's some bikers riding through the town. And then suddenly one of them crashes into just this giant green wall. And that what ends up happening is when the rest of them get out there, they almost see this gigantic green dome that hovers around everything. And this is where stuff gets a little bonkers. Now, one of the things to understand here is that while Hal Jordan is not playing the traditional role of a test pilot, as we're used to, a lot of his character elements remain the same, right? He's the first one out there saying these guys need help, somebody call an ambulance. So he doesn't really hold back and say, well, we should wait. He's not really like a coward or anything like that, right? He's still very much the guy who jumps out into the heat of battle if it's necessary here. And when he gets up there, he says it's like there's some kind of a wall that it gives, but it's like a force field in a movie. Now, he's initially told by Joe, stop touching this, right? And she says that green glow could be radiation for all we know. But the response of Hal is that biker must have hit this thing at 100 miles an hour. He wasn't wearing a helmet, and his head, there's nothing left of it. And that's where they're kind of looking around, and Joe's I think it's curved. Right? So they're kind of figuring out the nature of this as things go on. And in fact, this other guy's biker friends, they show up here and then they leave. They just turn around and ride away. And they're kind of trying to figure out why. Right? It's they didn't even see that their buddy was dead on the road. And that's where Joe Mullane is it's like they don't see anything strange at all. What in the world is going on here? But then Joe looks up and she sees what looks to be the Green Lantern symbol in the sky. And then Abin Sur shows up. Now, this is a huge deviation from Abin Sur as he's traditionally depicted, both physically within DC Comics as far as his appearance goes, as well as the role he plays. In the traditional Green Lantern mythos, which something to understand is that when Jeff Johns came along and did Green Lantern Rebirth, he kept the original Hal Jordan story intact, right? So Hal Jordan, the way he was introduced in the old DC Showcase comics, as well as how he was getting his story done in Green Lantern Secret Origin by Jeff Johns, by and large, it's all still pretty much the same, right? 80 to 90% of the original material is carried on. And so the way the original story played out was that Abin Sur had just kind of crash landed on Earth, and that initially Guy Gardner was supposed to be the first Green Lantern, but the ring chose Hal Jordan instead. And so Hal Jordan just kind of goes on to become a superhero after getting the ring, learning what it's capable of, that sort of thing. That's not how it plays out here. That instead, what ends up happening is Abin Sur addresses the crowd and he says, I am the Abin Sur. Have understanding that I come to you from the Green Lantern. I exist at the green level of light. Be without fear. Now, initially, everybody's kind of freaked out about this, as you could probably expect, right? A giant green dome just erects over a city. An alien who looks pretty funky comes down and starts talking about being without fear. Most people are going to freak out, if for no other reason than the fact that, we as humans don't know how to function if we don't have total control of a situation, or at least some understanding. Now, Guy Gardner, as he's presented here as basically the sheriff of the town, is not really the Guy Gardner that we're familiar with from DC Comics, from the main DC universe. Guy Gardner in the main DC universe is kind of a dick, but we love him for it. He's that one guy in the friend group that, like, you know is going to be rude to pretty much everybody, but you can't just really bring yourself to get rid of him because you love him too much, right? The lovable jerk, essentially, in DC. This guy's very different, right? He's not nearly as hardcore. Instead, he's kind of what you would expect from a small town sheriff who's met by a situation that he can't really begin to understand. And that's why he says, like, I'm the sheriff, it makes me the authority here, the law, right? You understand what laws are. And that's when Abin Sur is like, I have understanding. Judgment will now commence. And at that point, he sticks a hand out, and it becomes a kind of standoff. And no one in the town knows how to respond, right? Like Abin Sur says, judgment is in progress. Guy Gardner, you are not an entity who currently exists in the emotional spectrum of light. Be without fear. And he says, be entirely without fear. And so where this whole kind of situation is going down, you have Joe and you have Jon Stewart, and they're kind of trying to talk the situation down to a degree. And so when Joe addresses the group, she makes a really interesting case here. Right, where Guy Gardner says, like, we don't know what this thing's capable of. The response of Joe is like, I mean, we can make a guess, right, from the spaceship and the bubble that's over our entire town. And initially, Guy doesn't realize it's a whole bubble. He's kind of so caught up in the heat of the moment that he's not really looking around at everything else that's going on. And that's where Jon Stewart says that force field overhead extends to the town's limits. It's a dome, right? We saw a motorcycle crash into it. The rider didn't make it. And that's where Joe says that's what it's capable of. What we don't know is what it wants. So what do you want, Guy? Do you want to escalate this? Do you want to make it worse? Or do you want to keep it reasonable? And so following that, Guy Gardner orders everybody to lower their weapons. But it doesn't make any difference. Because where Guy Gardner says, like, let's start again, we don't understand Abin Sur, we do not have understanding, tell us what you want. Abin Sur fires on Guy Gardner and kills him on the spot. And then literally at that point, Abin Sur is just like, judgment is in progress. Be without fear. And just starts destroying everybody. So seemingly, being without fear means to be without life. You know, it's kind of how you could interpret this. Now, of course, everybody starts firing on him, and then that's when you start to see green hard light constructs popping up in the sense of a kind of protective force field right around Abin Sur. And he just keeps saying to all of them, be entirely without fear, and kills them all in the process, or at least most of them in the process. And we're talking about like decapitations, cutting off hands, I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff that's going on. But through it all, Hal Jordan is just like, okay. He just walks up to Abin Sur with a gun in his hand and points it at him. And Abin Sur just looks at him and he's like, Hal Jordan, judgment is in progress. And in fact, initially Jon Stewart comes up and kind of gets Hal Jordan to lower his gun, if for no other reason than to kind of help everybody else who's essentially injured. And Abin Sur looks at Jon Stewart and just says his name, right? Jon Stewart, be without fear. And then just takes off. Literally, Abin Sur just flies away. And so this creates a lot of confusion here, and it creates a lot of ambiguity as to what it all means. And so what this does is it kind of gives us a chance to jump back into how the story properly unfolds to give us a better indication of like what all's playing out here. Because after this is all said and done, you initially have Hal Jordan who's just walking along a back road, right? And it's just this voice in his head, be without fear, right? This voice that says, you are in the absence of light. I am the secret heart within every star. Be without fear. Hal Jordan, you must be without fear. And Hal Jordan kind of says it to himself, right? And he's like, I am so scared right now. I am so terrified. But then a cop just kind of pulls up on him, right? And the cop isn't really there to harass him or anything like that. It's just a dude walking down the side of a road in the middle of a desert. It's kind of like, okay, what's this guy doing, right? It just seems a little weird. The problem is that things start to go sideways when Hal Jordan isn't giving any direct answers to this cop's questions, and he keeps his hand in his pocket. And so at that point, the cop just kind of thinks like he might have drugs or a weapon or something along those lines. And literally, it's just like, it's a weapon, isn't it, right? Like, is it a weapon? Answer me. Are you carrying a weapon? The situation escalates like that, and Hal Jordan gets exceedingly sad and scared when it does, because he tries to tell the cop, like, don't, right? Put your weapon down, like, do not, like, my name is Hal Jordan, I'm from Evergreen, but the cop, again, trying to maintain control of a situation that he thinks he doesn't have control of, escalates the situation even further. And then for a moment, you see Hal Jordan's hand, it's completely black, and then everything just kind of goes sideways, right? The cop just vanishes into thin air. Like literally just disappears, right? All that's left are like the smoldering ruins of where he used to be and some badges. Now, that's an important thing here, right? The fact that you have his gold badge that's there and any other gold parts of his outfit that he was wearing at that point in time. And so that's when you switch over to a place called May and Mo's Diner. Now, that's when Hal Jordan comes in. And again, the situation almost kind of repeats itself, because the reason being here is that we're going to see a news blip here in a second, and it's going to instill a level of fear in people here because they don't fully understand what's going on. And while it may not necessarily affect them directly, again, we as human beings don't really know how to function when we don't have at least some understanding of what's happening around us. It makes us feel helpless, and in that helplessness, we become fearful, and in that fearfulness, we become violent. And so in this instance, when Hal shows up, he just asks for some water and he just sits down at the bar and just kind of chills, right? And, she's like, are you okay? Like the waitress is like, are you fine? He's like, no, something happened. But then suddenly the TV shifts, right? And you end up getting this kind of news blip where this person comes on and they say, what you're seeing is helicopter footage from Evergreen, Nevada, a small town about 15 miles from the California state line. This footage is live and unedited. It has not been tampered with in any way. And so what you end up seeing in this town is just a giant Green Lantern insignia that's just crash landed in this place. And the reporter says the destruction seems almost total, though no bodies have so far been recovered. We're trying to get information on the exact nature of this object. Now, as you guys can tell from this drawing here, the object itself did not flatten the entire town. So the question has to be asked, if it only flattened one portion of the town, what happened to everybody in the town? Where did everybody go? Why is it considered to be an almost total loss? And basically, pretty much everybody's dead. And that's what the people in this restaurant ask, right? Like, what in the world is going on? Because suddenly the reporter comes in and is like, I've been informed, we can't show you any more of the footage. An official statement's being prepared. We'll have more updates when we can. And it just cuts off. Now, here's an important thing to understand here. In the most recent issue of Absolute Superman, one of the Brainiacs addressed the idea of Owens, right? Those individuals who historically create Green Lanterns. It's the first real connection we have in the Absolute Universe between the various titles. And so if that connection is maintained and if that connection is real, it's entirely possible that the peacemakers that we see in the Superman comics, they're the ones that shut this report down, right? The government effectively blocked it out. And so what you end up getting is effectively panic, right? That the people in this restaurant, it's not enough to fly into hysteria, start freaking out and destroying things and so on and so forth, but it's a question of what happened in Evergreen? Like what in the world went on? And so that's where Hal Jordan says he said his name was Abin Sur, that he came from somewhere else. The symbol in the sky, that belonged to him. And that's where the waitress is like, you were there? Like you were in Evergreen? Like that thing on the news was some kind of a spaceship. And the response of Hal, he called it the Green Lantern. And another guy here just kind of starts flying off the handle, right? Just seemingly in a way that makes no sense whatsoever. But he's like, what are you talking about, right? What does that mean? Now, again, this is fear setting in, right? This is this guy who doesn't understand what's going on, and that lack of understanding makes him feel helpless. And so because of that feeling of helplessness, he starts lashing out. And this woman, this next to him even says hey, look, it's whatever's going on, it's not his fault. But the response of Hal is, yes, it is, right? I made a mistake. I wanted to be a hero. And Abin Sur, he did something to me, gave me something. He gave me a weapon. Now, that's the wrong thing to say when you're standing in a diner and all these people are just fearful, right? These little small town diners, yeah, they all carry guns in case some drifter comes walking in trying to rob the joint or do harm to people. And no one's going to feel bad, right? They're going to kill this guy, bury him out back, and you'll never see or hear from him again. And so this kind of situation is what Hal's wandered into. And that's why the waitress is like, are you talking about a gun? And she doesn't say, she's like, there's a gun under the counter, but she doesn't tell him that. And Hal's just like, no, it's worse, much worse than that. And she just says, drink your water. And this other guy is like, what's in your pocket, son? And it's the exact same scenario with the cop unfolding again. And even Hal says that. On the highway, there was a cop. He asked the same question. And he's like, I should really go right now. And again, this guy's like, what happened to the cop? What did you do? And then immediately goes to attack Hal. Again, trying to have some control over the situation. He pulls Hal's hand out of his pocket, and it's revealed to basically be the Black Hand. The hand, in turn, levitates this guy into the air and kills him on the spot. And much like what you saw with the police officer, that gold piece comes crashing down onto the ground. And that's where Hal says, it's the hand, right? I'm holding it back. It takes all I have to hold it back, keep it away from people, but I cannot control it. It responds to danger. And that's where the waitress fires on him. And then in turn, Hal Jordan momentarily loses control and the waitress gets everybody in the restaurant killed. And so that's why you have Hal Jordan who's just kind of sitting there. And then suddenly what ends up happening is that this Black Hand starts to heal him. Right? It restores him of his injuries. Now, there is a bit to explain here when it comes to the Black Hand, because this is not a new concept in DC. The Black Hand's been around for quite some time, and in fact, the Black Hand was at one point a villain. I'm not aware if he still exists in DC Comics anymore, but that guy was an instrumental part of Blackest Night in DC, which is to say, Black Hand became the first Black Lantern, right? The Lantern Corps that is essentially a Lantern Corps composed of the undead, zombies, right? And that the Black Lantern rings would attach to individuals who were dead, but the only way to charge the ring was to kill living beings. And that in turn would bring the rings up to full power, which made them astronomically powerful. The whole idea of Blackest Night was that it was the Black Lantern Corps essentially taking over. And it wasn't until the White Lantern started to emerge going towards the end of Blackest Night and going into Brightest Day that you actually saw the Black Lantern Corps defeated. But one of the other things to kind of discuss here is the nature of the emotional spectrum. And that's what makes this so wonky, is because when Abin Sur is talking about things like, I am on the green level, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with the Green Lantern mythos, the emotional spectrum is almost like the Force from Star Wars. But instead of there simply just being the light side and the dark side of the Force, that the Force is composed of emotional states. So Sith, for example, Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine, we could say, for example, they derive their power from like fear. I mean, as Sith, they derive their power from like just heightened levels of emotion, right? You know, from fear and rage and what we would consider to be the more reckless emotions, more passionate emotions. But kind of keeping this simple, they would derive their power from fear. So they would be, for example, like Yellow Lanterns. And then you could say that because the Jedi are more emotionally stable, right? And because they are people who fight on behalf of good and they're constantly keeping their emotions in check, it takes a lot of willpower. So they would likely be Green Lanterns, potentially Blue Lanterns, depending on, you know, what kind of hope they imbue. But again, the role here and the bigger point that I'm making is that different Lantern Corps tap into different parts of the emotional spectrum. And there's benefits and drawbacks to all of them. But the bigger thing here is we don't know if that emotional spectrum is being rolled over here in the same way, or if there's something much larger going on. What you're not seeing here are traditional lantern rings. What you are seeing play out here is that instead of a ring of power being given to a person who can use that ring of power for their own ends, that instead the very powers these people wield seem to tie more into their personalities and their emotional states than anything else. And so instead of the situation where a person is given a power ring and they draw on the ring's power to achieve any particular goal, instead the power that they're given is more of a reflection of them. And how they use that power and how that power manifests is a direct reflection of who they are on a personal level. So again, it's very ambiguous here. There's a lot of questions that are not being answered. But the other part of this is that as Hal Jordan stands in this diner, Sojourner pops up, right? Jo Mullein shows up here and she looks like a Green Lantern. And that's where you get a conversation between the two of them, right? She asks the question like, what happened to you? Right? Like what went on here? Like the last I saw, the last that I remember, you had a gun in your hands and you were pointing it at Abin Sur. And now you're here with like this glowing black hand and all these people are dead. So what in the heck happened? She's like, because you never did give that gun back to John, right? You never handed it over to him when he asked you to. And that's where Hal actually kind of materializes a gun in his hand and is like, I guess I never quite got around to it. Now, there are theories out there that for Hal Jordan, that he has the black hand because the gun itself is a representation of that, which is kind of representation of the fact that he is potentially a serial killer or something like that, keeping a very dark part of his history secret. And the black hand is kind of the physical manifestation of Hal's darker self. We don't have the answer to that. Again, it's just kind of a fan theory that's out there, but Hal even tells her, like, Like when he just materializes a gun out of thin air, he tells her like, you should get out of here, Joe, right? He's like, this thing, it's hungry or something like hungry, something alien, but it wants the light. And Joe asks like the green light, and he says, no, like any spectrum of light. It doesn't really want to absorb it. That's not the right way to say. It wants to supersede it, overturn it. It wants to win the argument, Joe. It's very, very old. And Joe's just kind of like, I mean, you're weirding me out here, right? And Hal just kind of goes on. He says, it should have been forgotten. It should be weak. An idea nobody believes, but something fed it. Something gave it a chance. Now it's everywhere, every little piece in everything, all the way out there, all the way in here. And I'm fighting it, Joe, as hard as I can. I don't want to listen to it. I do not want to, but it keeps telling me that I was right. Now, the question of who it is that fed this thing and keep it alive, we don't fully know, because again, that goes into a lot of unanswered questions. We know the absolute universe was created by Darkseid himself. So this is a universe that is powered by the very belief system that Darkseid has. So it could be that Darkseid just created this and then threw it into this universe, and it's been here since. Something to also keep in mind here, these superheroes that exist in this universe, they don't know that Darkseid created their entire reality, right? It's totally separate from the main DC universe, but they're completely unaware of that. They don't know how it all originated. And so again, there's a lot of ambiguity. The only real cool thing that comes out of this, as far as hard knowledge goes, is that you pick up with a bit of a conversation in the aftermath of everything that initially happened before Hal Jordan was just wandering down the road. And what goes on is in this conversation between John Stewart and Sojourner and Hal, is that John Stewart says, okay, right? Like we're all feeling the adrenaline of what we just experienced, right? We all kind of have a few regrets on how we could have handled things and so on and so forth. And he says, it's natural to think about what we might have done differently. It makes sense. He says, but like I said, Hal, maybe you were not wrong. What's happening here, whatever alien judgment is being levied upon us, I don't think anyone's coming to save us from it. So at this point, the conversation takes place while Abin Sur is still there and passing judgment on the entire town, however long that takes. And so in turn, John asked the question, so if it comes to it, do we take Abin Sur out of the equation? And if we do, I think I know how we can do that. And he holds up this gold ring. And what he realizes and what he's effectively telling them is that the powers of Abin Sur and seemingly the powers of the green light do not affect the color yellow. Now that is a major part of the Green Lantern mythos. And a lot of people have kind of expressed confusion as to why, right, given the various histories of Green Lantern and whatnot. The long and short of this explanation is that long before Jeff Johns showed up and took over the Green Lantern mythos, that yes, you had the color yellow, which was the weakness of Green Lanterns, and that was it. Jeff Johns largely considered that to be just a silly weakness if there was no real reason behind it. And so he started introducing the idea of entities that occupy and represent the emotional spectrum, the entity of fear, the entity of willpower, the entity of hope, so on and so forth. The entity of fear specifically is Parallax. And while the original Emerald Twilight storyline, when Hal Jordan declared himself Parallax and wiped everything out of existence, while that story at the time that it was written in the early 1990s was just Hal Jordan adopting the name and nothing more, Jeff Johns came back and actually established that at one point in time, the Parallax fear entity was locked inside the central power battery of the Green Lantern Corps, which is where the Lantern Corps derives their powers. And that because of that, Parallax was able to influence the Green Lantern Corps in a variety of ways. Because Parallax is literally yellow, that's where the color yellow became the weakness of the Green Lantern Corps. But more so than that, Parallax was able to directly influence Hal Jordan over time. And so that's why you see a lot of these explanations that when Hal Jordan declared himself Parallax in the original Emerald Twilight story, it was actually him just basically being possessed by the Parallax fear entity. It was a change that Jeff Johns made during his run on Green Lantern. But again, we don't know how all these little plot threads are going to tie together. We don't know if Parallax is real. We don't know why it is the color yellow, gold, what have you, is basically immune to the influence of the Green Lanterns, because there's so much information we don't have. But it is amazing. And honestly, it's one of the coolest stories out there. The mystery is really what just kind of keeps me coming back. But let me know what you guys think down in the comment section. This is clearly the least direct of the absolute stories that's going on out there because, you know, just kind of how Al Ewing does his thing. But thank you all for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.